untraceable, unknown and unpredictable. After a string of recent cases in Europe and across the world, lone wolf terrorism has been identified as one of the most worrying terrorism trends today. Despite that, globally, most of the 12,500 deaths due to terrorist attacks last year were the work of well-known groups. But zoom into Europe and we're dealing with a different picture. Numbers decreased dramatically. Of the 174 attacks, the 2 that proved fatal were at the hands of solo actors. And ultimately, that's because tracking a lone terrorist is a way lot harder for authorities than those affiliated to a group. So who are these so-called lone wolves? Let's take a look.
77 people died in the Oslo and Utøya attacks last year. The massacre was carried out by the lone right-wing extremist Anders Behring Breivik. Although not a new phenomenon, lone wolf terrorism was suddenly thrown into the spotlight. American authorities have warned this is a major threat. Alan Bauer, professor and researcher in criminology in Paris, New York and Beijing, profiles this kind of solo assailant.
Generally,
in a criminal and terrorist point of view, lone wolves are isolated individuals that engage themselves alone without any command or logistical support. There are 2 categories, those that let themselves be caught and those that don't. Essentially, they try to say who they are and what they do. On the other side of the ideological divide, there's also evidence to show that Al-Qaeda has encouraged these types of actions. They are relatively effective because they have a certain time. They don't leave too many traces, and they oblige authorities to use a huge amount of investigative resources. Also, above all, the lack of connection with the exterior makes it much harder for intelligence and investigation services to identify them. For Professor Bauer, what's worrying is the blurring of the boundaries between terrorism and criminality, as shown in the case of gunman Mohamed Merah in Toulouse. The hybrids, those that are not 100% pure terrorists. We have terrorist gangs. We have organizations that we think are terrorists, but they're not. But they're rather criminals or degenerated guerrillas. All a series of situations where the frontier between 100% terrorism and 100% criminality has been totally modified. And it is these grey areas that makes the work of authorities all the more difficult to track and stop lone terrorists before they strike to deadly effect.
I'm joined on the front line to discuss the issue of lone wolf terrorism by Claude Moniquet, a former French spy and now CEO of the European Strategic Intelligence and Security Centre, and Dr. Guido Steinberg, a terrorism expert with the German Institute of International and Security Affairs and former advisor to the German Chancellery. Claude, I'd like to begin with you. As we heard in the report, lone wolf terrorists, neither 100% terrorist nor 100% criminal. Is this the new emerging face of terrorism today?
What is very new is that the number of those people is growing. In the past, in a normal terrorist cell, we could add maybe 1 or 2 people with a criminal past on 10 or 20 people arrested. Today, in France, in the last operation 2 weeks ago, we had 8 on 12 people. We had approximately 8 people with a criminal past, and also, which is interesting, 8 people who were converted to Islam, which we were not Muslim born. That's new, the number, the importance of the figure.
But also, when we're looking at figures, Anders Breivik was not Islamist. Absolutely. And he was responsible for 77 of the 79 killings in 2011. How different is he to other lone wolf terrorists?
Well, he was successful. I think that's the main difference. We have seen similar cases for some years already. It has been a trend, at least since 2005 in Europe. But in the beginning, most of these people were not successful because you can't really learn how to build a bomb on the internet. And that is why Anders Breivik, I think, is so important. He was a lot more successful than Al-Qaeda in most of its attacks attempts to attack in Europe in recent years, I'm afraid that he might become a model for other right-wing extremists, possibly left-wingers, but definitely jihadists.
Are they really acting alone, though? Something that struck me is it not a convenient smokescreen for kind of authorities to say, OK, well, these guys act alone, therefore we can't catch them? Are they really acting alone when they're plotting these acts?
Not in all cases, and I have my doubts. In many cases, we had the suitcase bombers in Germany who failed to detonate a bomb in two German trains in July 2006, who were connected to, at least indirectly, to Al-Qaeda in Iraq through relatives in Lebanon. I have my doubts about the Mohammed Merah case, and I would not be surprised if the French authorities, in this case, of course, are extremely nervous, because if this came out, it would tell us something about mistakes.
So Al-Qaeda, in its magazine Inspire has called on its militants to act as individuals, as lone wolves. But is that more out of desperation because they're feeling, they're feeling the strain now because their operations are being dismantled, or is it is it a good tactic?
I think it's both. It's the desperation because, of course, Al-Qaeda's stricto sensu is just cornered today in the AfPak region, Afghanistan, Pakistan. It is very difficult for them to move and to do things. Approximately three leaders of Al-Qaeda on 4 were killed or catched by the American or others the last 10 years. So they have no possibility, so capacities today. So they are desperate, but in the same time, I think they understood something very important. They understood that they haven't to train people, to spend money, to attract the people to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, to train them for months and send them back in Europe. They could find in Europe a very easy manpower in the suburbs with people who are desperate, who have personal accounts to settle with Europe because they fail their integration, they feel rightly or wrongly that they are excluded from the society. And those people, with just a little push, could be driven to action.
Proportionately, there's been in Europe, I think, less kind of Muslim terrorism than other forms, isn't that correct?
I'm not so sure. If you look to the numbers, the figures since 2001, thousands of people were at moment or another arrested in Europe for offences linked to Islamist terrorists. Most of them were released, but we have hundreds of people in jail today in Europe for Islamist terrorist-related offences. So I think we have a lot of dangerous people, of bad guys.
Okay. And in terms of radicalisation, a lot of it doesn't only take place by individuals going to training camps. A lot of it's taking place in terms of the internet, and we hear about electronic jihad and things like that. Is enough being done to counter that? Is it possible to counter that?
It is very hard, but I think that's a crucial question, because I think that lone wolf terrorism and the internet are connected. Because otherwise, how do you get the ideas? I mean, this is how in most of these cases where we know that people have acted independently or relatively independent from a larger organization, the internet played a huge role, especially videos that these people saw. For example, the case of the German Kosovar who killed 2 American soldiers on Frankfurt Airport in March 2011. He was exclusively radicalized through the internet, and there is nothing you can do to eradicate the presence of these materials on the internet.
Counter-terrorism isn't really following up then with the threat that we're facing.
I think we are certainly not at our best. That's very clear. But I will be so negative about the work of the intelligence and security service in Europe. We did a lot. If we look to the figures once again, since 10 years, probably 30 or 40 important terrorist attacks were avoided in Europe due to the work of intelligence, police and justice. That's not so bad.
So what would you say, if we look at the bigger picture, what's the biggest threat we're facing in terms of terrorism today? Is it lone wolf terrorism, or is it something else?
No, I think it's still organized jihadist activity, but I would always, at the same time, I would always insist that that is not the important question, because we have to fight the whole spectrum.
Absolutely.
And some countries, including Germany, have forgot about fighting parts of the spectrum because they focused on the jihadists after September 11. In Germany, I think we forgot about the right-wing extremists. And especially in a country where these groups are that strong, especially in East Germany, that was a major mistake. So we should not really focus on anything, but not focus on anything, but rather fight the jihadists, the Shiite terrorists, the left-wingers, the right-wing extremists. And even if for a time we think they might be weak or they might be irrelevant, that is often not the case. Anders Breivik, I think, is the best example for that.
So, but then again, if we look at the wider picture again, you know, September 11th, Madrid, London, you're not ruling out an attack on that scale?
No, of course, we can't, because the reality could deny us today or tomorrow. But I think large-scale attacks like September 11 or Madrid or London are quite unlikely today in Europe. Possible, but unlikely.
Gentlemen, many thanks. While the focus of our discussion has been primarily lone wolf terrorism, there's nothing to rule out, as we've been hearing, the possibility of a large-scale terrorist attack in Europe. But our continent has so far been spared the devastation experienced in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq and Pakistan, who combined account for 8,500 terrorism deaths last year. But let's try and end on a slightly brighter note. Globally, attacks have dropped by about 12%. So that's all for this edition of On The Frontline. We're active on social media and keen to hear your comments and thoughts.